Hey everybody, it's Aidan here once again, and welcome back to another edition of Storytime, where I sidestep sim racing for about 20 minutes or so to look at the weird, wonderful, and sometimes outrageous stories from the real world, or fictional world as was the case last time, of motorsport. Today we've got the story of the most successful engine ever created, and possibly the most legendary of all time. That engine is the Cosworth DFV, or to use the pronunciation they use in Doncaster, Cosworth. Cosworth, as a company, has supplied a total of 67 Formula 1 teams over 50 years, and the DFV actually turned 50 in the June of 2017. Now you might be sat there thinking, but Ferrari has won 200 odd races while Cosworth hasn't. But while Ferrari changes the engine every year with new upgrades and stuff, the DFV stayed the same for its working life. Cosworth was founded in 1958 by Keith Duckworth and Mike Costin, whose name could be misheard as Mike Austin, but it's definitely Mike Costin. Like many great British engineering institutions, it started out in a shed in Shaftesbury Mews in London. The name Cosworth is a portmanteau of Costin and Duckworth. Cosworth. The company initially started out doing contract work for Lotus, as both the founders were Lotus employees. They tuned the engines, rebuilt the engines, and other key mechanical components. Costin continued to work for Lotus until 1962, doing Cosy-related projects in his spare time, while Duckworth ran the company full-time. Both men were key in developing some of the road cars as well, including the Lotus 15 and the Lotus Elan, as well as leading Lotus's foreign racing interests. The Lotus 23 that they worked on was actually banned from Le Mans due to failing many of the regulatory tests. This all happened as part of Lotus and specifically Chapman's ethos of simplify and add lightness. The Lotus 23, looked after by Costin and Duckworth, had an insufficient windscreen height, a fuel tank that was too big, a turning circle that was too big, too low ride height, and no spare wheel. The 23 also had illegal front wheels that were too narrow, also saving on weight. Although the larger fuel tank... I don't see how that helps. Lotus was also running cars in the 1.3 litre GT class and won with the Lotus Elite. The French organisers then made the situation worse, with journalist Gerard Crombach reporting that the Ferrari 246 and 268 also had the same ride height issues, but they were allowed to race because Enzo threw a hissy fit and threatened not to participate at the event. Pissed at this, Chapman vowed never to race at Le Mans again, and focused all of his attentions towards other forms of motorsport. Cosworth's first production engines were the Mark II, Mark V, Mark VIII and Mark XIV, and they initially only sold them to Chapman and Lotus. Eventually, Cosworth began selling engines to junior Formula teams, with these engines being the Mark III, Mark IV, Mark XI and Mark XVII. The Sports Car Club of America, the SCCA, allowed the Cosy Mark XIII to be used, and the engine, based off the twin cam found in the Lotus Elan, dominated sports car racing in America. This allowed Cosworth to gain a stable financial foundation, and in turn moved away from road cars to focus squarely on racing interests. Lotus won the title with Jim Clark in 1963 and 1965, but struggled to get constructors' wins after that. In 1966, the FIA announced that the rules for 1967 would mean the maximum engine capacity would be raised from 1.5 litres to 3 litres. The Coventry Climax engines were fast revving and were well suited to the needs of the time, but Coventry had decided that they were not going to go forward with making a 3 litre engine, as it wasn't worth their business interests, as well as the Flat 16 project that had completely failed. Chapman needed a new engine. The BRM engines were too complex and heavy, Maseratis kept blowing up, Honda's was heavier than an aircraft carrier, and Ferrari was going to quite simply say, vaffanculo. In addition, it was underpowered. There was only the Repco engine that fit the brief for fuel efficiency, reliability and lightness, but it couldn't be tuned the way that Chapman wanted to tune it. So he went to see his old mates over at Cosworth. Yeah, alright Colin, yeah, we'll build you one, but we need 100 grand to do it. That's about £1.7 million today. Chapman didn't have 100 grand. The budget for the year was 100 grand. So he went and spoke to Ford and Aston Martin to try and secure some money, but they both told him to go away. He then went and spoke to Ford's UK PR chief Walter Hayes, who put him in contact with Harley Kopp, who had backed Ford's entry into NASCAR in the 50s. They chatted over dinner, maybe a cheeky Nando's, I don't know, drew up a business plan, and that was sent to Ford UK's chairman Stanley Gillen, who then sent it to the head office in Detroit as part of a two-part plan. Step 1. Build a 4-cylinder twin-cam engine for Formula 2, and Step 2. Build a V8 engine for Formula 1. The engine wasn't ready until the June of 1967, 3 races into the season. Graham Hill, hired by specific request of Ford, put the car on pole by half a second and led the first 10 laps until the camshaft went. Jim Clark, in an identical car, went on to destroy the competition in that race. Clark took 3 more wins that year, but teething problems with the engine and the general fragility of Lotuses meant he finished 3rd in the standings. But when the engine worked, by God it worked! Initially, the deal was only Lotus would get these engines. That was until Ford realised the same problems that Chapman had conveniently neglected to tell them about. Enzo's engine was underpowered. Honda's was too heavy. The others kept blowing up. Ford believed their image would be tarnished if they continued to decimate the opposition. Since Ford already had a bit of a personal feud with Enzo Ferrari, Ford decided to mass-produce the engine, sell it to the other teams, and then dominate Formula 1 and really rub it in Enzo's face. The beef between Ford and Ferrari has already been explained in a previous Storytime episode regarding the Ford GT40. You can see that video by clicking the card at the top right of your screen. Ford took Chapman to one side and told him that he'd have to share this godlike engine with the other children. That's how good it was. The fact they had to give it to everybody else to make sure there was some competition. Okay, yes, Mercedes sells engines to other teams, but the differences between the engine in Hamilton's car compared to George Russell's aren't as night and day as the DFV was compared to Ferrari's, for instance. Ford initially sold the engine to Ken Tyrrell, who put an advert in the paper for any potential sponsors to come along. "Give me the money for a Ford DFV and I'll put Jackie Stewart in the car," he said. What followed was an era where teams big and small could buy an off-the-shelf engine pre-built and then build their cars around it. Chapman had already done this, as well as this being the story of the DFV. The monocoque was also born. As a result of the DFV and monocoque construction, this V8 was bolted straight onto the chassis and took all the rear suspension load, which was much lighter solution than having a bulky subframe. The engine itself was a 90-degree 2,993cc V8 that produced 408 brake horsepower at 9,000 RPM, with 370 Nm or 272 pound-foot of torque at 7,000 RPM. In 1967, the engine would have set teams back the bargain price of £7,500, which in 2005 was still only 90 grand. DFV, it should be pointed out, stood for double 4-valve, which is just a poncy British way of saying V8. In 1969 and 1973, every race was won by a car running the DFV. In total, the engine took a total of 155 wins from 262 races between 1967 and 1985, with the ground effect years of the late 70s adding a few extra years of life onto the engine. The flat 12 engines that were emerging allowed for better handling due to the centre of gravity, but because of the engines being where the Venturi tunnels needed to be for the ground effect to work, the DFV then killed off the V12 and flat 12s that were thought to dominate until the turbo era of F1 in the mid-80s. But even in the early days of Renault's experiments with turbocharging, the DFV somehow still soldiered on. While the early turbo engines were powerful and better at high-altitude tracks like Interlagos, Kyalami and Dijon, they were still too heavy and complicated and therefore unreliable. The turbo engines also suffered from horrific turbo lag, which made tracks like Monaco, Zolder, Detroit and Brands Hatch races where the naturally aspirated V8s could run away with things. The British teams were able to use ground effect in the DFV so well that even at tracks like Hockenheim, Silverstone and Montreal, power circuits, they could win with an engine that was 15 to 20 years out of date. Unfortunately, a lot of the other teams felt that turbocharging engines was the future. Once the reliability was stabilised, they could start chucking out 500, 600, 800 horsepower, way more than what naturally aspirated engines of the time could produce. And I say we, my dad for instance, got to actually see this happen when cars in the mid-80s had qualifying engines capable of 1,200 horsepower. By 1986, the DFV was dead. The last win came in 1983 when Michele Alboreto won at Detroit, and Martin Brundle was the last man to competitively race a DFV-powered car at Adelaide in 1985. The advent of turbos in Formula One led Duckworth to make a play on the famous Enzo Ferrari quote, "Turbochargers are for people that can't build engines." Maybe some of you can agree with that sentiment. Some of you might even like the sound of a turbo wastegate going. But the DFV was not just used for Formula One. Ford created the DFX variant that was a turbocharged variation of the DFV for kart, which won 10 Indy 500s in a row between 78 and 87. It also won 9 kart titles between 79 and 87. Cosworth continued to supply engines to Formula One and other motorsports after the initial turbo era. The Cosworth Duratec R engine was the success behind the Ford Focus rally car of 2001. They also built the DFZ and HBA 3.5 litre engines for Ford that got supplied to teams like Benetton, as well as supplying electronics that find their way onto many steering wheels in the modern age, like those found on LMP2 cars and the Dallara IR18. They also helped Ford produce tuned versions of road cars, such as the Escort and the Sierra, and one of my personal quests in life is to restore and own a Sierra Cosworth. The Cosworth CA was the first F1 engine to crack 20,000 RPM on track, but restrictions regarding engine life and the FIA imposing rev limits mean this will probably never happen again. It has to be said, it was no accident that happened. Cosworth intended the engine to run that high, while others made their engines run at 19 and change for reliability. To date, the last engine Cosworth supplied to a Formula One team was Marussia back in 2013, before withdrawing just as the sport switched to the hybrid V6 era. But even then, the V8s of 2006 to 2013 were mere shadows of the DFV. The last Cosworth win in F1 was Giancarlo Fisichella at Brazil in 2003 for Jordan. It's hard to imagine Formula One without Cosworth. Much like Ferrari and Renault, a Cosworth engine is synonymous with racing. It's still the yardstick from which all engines are measured, and is the soundtrack to the killer years of Formula One. The DFV won 12 drivers' titles: 1968, 69, 70, 71, 72, 73, 74, 76, 78, 80, 81, and 82. It won the Constructors' title 10 times in 68, 69, 70, 71, 72, 73, 74, 78, 80, and 81. It's easy to get misty-eyed over it, even though I was not there. My dad, meanwhile, got to go to the British Grand Prix when the DFV was in service, and the videos do not do the sound justice, apparently. Maybe a trip to the Festival of Speed at Goodwood is in order. And there will never be another engine like it. It was cheap, it was off the shelf, it was reliable, and competitive. Chassis, most of the time, were never competitive off the shelf. Alas, those days are gone. But at least we can look back at it and just think, fucking hell. So this has been the full story of the Cosworth DFV. If you've enjoyed and or learned something today, give this video a thumbs up, and if you want to see more like this or sim racing related content, be sure to subscribe. And I will aim to have a sim race of some kind up on Monday for you all. Also, if you want to support my channel in a more personal fashion, you can do so by going to my Patreon. Thanks very much for watching. I've been Adam Millward, and goodbye.